Thank you very much, Professor Muir. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. Sorry we cannot all be together in Nijmegen. It would have been much nicer. It is good morning for me. It is probably good afternoon for most of you. And I'm very sorry I was not able to participate in the conference so far because I was very busy writing my paper in the last 3 days. I had another papers to write the last 2 weeks, so I'm very sorry. I'm going to read my paper because it will make it more concise and clear. I cannot claim any expertise on Eastern Orthodoxy, so I can only offer a relatively sketchy and superficial outline of the globalization of Eastern Christianity from the comparative perspective of the globalization of other religions, particularly of Catholicism and Protestantism. Although this conference focuses on the 20th and 21st centuries, that is, on our contemporary global age, I've decided to present a longue durée perspective of the transformation of Eastern Christianity under 3 distinct historical phases of globalization, because only such a comparative historical perspective can elucidate what is distinctly characteristic of global orthodoxy during our contemporary global age. I'm not going to discuss contributions of the Eastern churches, particularly that of the Syriac Church of the East, to pre-modern process of transcontinental proto-globalizations. That is, the expansion of Eastern Christianity to Central, East, and Southeast Asia, in South Asia, before the onset of modern processes of globalization. In the strict sense of the term, one can only begin speaking of processes of globalization once the globe became a tangible reality for humanity that could be circumnavigated, that could be represented in maps, and thus could become something real in the imaginary and the consciousness of at least certain groups. The globe only became such a reality in the age of discoveries in the 16th and 17th centuries, making possible the connection of the old world of Afro-Eurasia with the newly discovered new world of the Americas, establishing for the first time a truly global world through novel transatlantic and trans-Pacific exchanges. In this respect, this early modern age constitutes literally the first globalization. It was a globalization initiated by the overseas colonial expansion of the Iberian Catholic monarchies, of Portugal into the East Indies, and of Spain into the West Indies. This was also the golden age of global Catholic missions, sponsored by the Catholic overseas empires and by the papacy, and carried out by Catholic religious orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and most particularly by the Jesuits, who were established in 1540 explicitly as the first global missionary order. As pointed out by the historian Pochiarchia, the centuries of Catholic renewal form the first period of truly global history, in that the early modern era was shaped by the encounter between Catholic Europe and the non-Christian world. This was the age when Catholicism became a world religion. But parallel to the overseas colonial expansion of Western European powers in the 16th and 17th centuries, first Portugal and Spain, then the Dutch Republic, the British, and England and France, there was a territorial colonial expansion of Orthodox Russia eastward onto the so-called Great Tartary, all the way to the Pacific and the border of the Chinese Empire, which marks the initial stage of the global expansion of Russian Orthodoxy. This expansion itself has to be viewed within the context of the competition of the 3 Romes. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453 marked the fall of Byzantium, the Second Rome. This fall triggered both the search of new routes to the Indies by the Iberian Catholic powers and the proclamation of Moscow as the Third Rome. In 1492, the very same year of Columbus' arrival in the Americas, Metropolitan Zosima of Muscovy, in his work Presentation of the Paschalion, called the Grand Duke Ivan of Muscovy, Ivan III, the new Tsar Constantine, and of the new Constantinople, Moscow. 1 year later, in 1493, the Treaty of Tordesillas, mediated by the Pope, who claimed universal jurisdiction over all non-Christian lands, traced a meridian dividing the globe into an eastern and a western hemisphere, granting Portugal sovereignty over the newly discovered territories of the East Indies, and Spain sovereignty over the newly discovered West Indies. A few years later, monk Philoteus addressed the pious king Ivan III with the apocalyptic vision of all Christian kingdoms came to an end and came together in a single kingdom of yours. Two Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will be no fourth. Scholars in Moscow explain the fall of Constantinople as the divine punishment for the sin of the union with the Catholic Church in the Council of Florence. The doctrine of the Third Rome implied that Moscow had become the heir of the Second Rome in its dual dimension of imperial sovereignty and ecclesiastical supremacy. Moscow rulers adopted now the title of Russian Tsars, claiming the inheritance of both Kievan Rus and Byzantium, while the Patriarch of Moscow assumed the title of Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, claiming not only autocephaly, but supremacy over Eastern Orthodoxy. The captivity of the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople and of all Orthodox churches in the Balkans and the Middle East under the Ottoman Empire seemed to justify the ideological fiction of the Third Rome, sacralizing the emergence of the newly denominated Holy Russian Empire. But the 16th century colonial territorial expansion of the Russian Empire eastwards was not accompanied by any serious project of evangelization of the politically subjugated peoples. As Luc Veronis has pointed out, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, the Russian church missionary outreach struggled under hostile state policies. Although it produced a few noteworthy individual exceptions, among them Bishop Guri, who in the middle 16th century evangelized the Muslim peoples of Kazan, the layman Trifon of Novgorod, who proclaimed the gospel to the Lav people, and Bishop Philotei of Tobolsk, who is reputed to have converted circa 40,000 indigenous peoples in various parts of Siberia. The contrast with the golden age of global Catholic missions is obvious on two accounts. Firstly, the Iberian Catholic monarchies obtained from the papacy the right of royal patronage and control of their respective national churches in exchange for their obligation to sponsor the evangelization of the conquered populations. The Russian rulers, by contrast, adopted a typical imperial policy of accommodation and toleration of the religions of their subjects in order to facilitate imperial rule. The result was a policy of ethno-religious differentiation and classification of its diverse populations along ethno-religious lines: Orthodox, Christian, Slavs, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and indigenous shamanic tribes, which has lasted until today. Secondly, Orthodoxy did not develop, at least not until the second half of the 19th century, a tradition of monastic missionary orders, such as the Mendicant Friars, Franciscans, and Dominicans, or of modern non-monastic religious orders, such as the Jesuits and the hundreds of new Catholic missionary orders, male and female, from the 16th century to the present, who follow the model of the Jesuits. During the middle of the 17th century, Russian explorers and settlers reached the Amur Basin, where they encountered the northern frontier of the Chinese Manchu Empire. After decades of military clashes, in 1689, Russian and Manchu delegations signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk, establishing diplomatic relations and settling the borders between the two empires along the Amur River, borders that stayed for almost 2 centuries until the Treaty of Aigun in 1858. The original treaty was written in Latin, having been mediated by Jesuits Thomas Pereira and Jean-François Gervillon, who served as trusted advisors of the Kangxi Emperor in the court at Beijing. 3 years later, as a gesture of gratitude for their diplomatic mission and for the loyal service of so many Jesuits before, the Kangxi Emperor issued the 1962, I'm very sorry. Can you take it there? Yeah, I'm very sorry.
Turn the computer.
Issued the 1692 Edict of Toleration of Catholic Christianity. This won't happen when you have conferences at home, that the telephone rings. In 1714, 25 years after the Nerchinsk Treaty, the first official Russian Orthodox mission was established in Beijing at the height of the Chinese rights controversy. A year later, in 1715, Pope Clement XI issued Ex Illa Die, the papal bull condemning and prohibiting the Chinese rites practiced by the Jesuits in the China mission. In retaliation, in 1721, the Kangxi Emperor banned Christian missions in China, insisting that he would only tolerate the Catholicism introduced by the Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci. So in the first phase of globalization, roughly from the 15th to the 18th century, if the first phase of globalization was the golden age of global Catholic missions, global Protestant missions would flourish during the second phase of globalization, roughly from the 18th century, at the time of the Industrial Revolution and the French and American democratic revolutions, to the 1960s. In the first globalization, there have been practically no major Protestant overseas missions other than those within the British colonial settlements in North America and the Caribbean. The two major Protestant colonial powers, the Dutch Republic and the British Empire, were primarily interested in trade, and their colonial empires were often started by privateers and eventually run by their East India and West India companies, which were not interested in antagonizing the natives and were thus hostile to any kind of Christian proselytizing. In fact, the first Protestant mission initiatives came not from the established Protestant churches, but from pietist dissenting evangelical groups. Individual Anglicans found the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge in 1698 and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel of the Faith in 1701. They became the forerunners of the many denominational missionary societies, the Baptist, the London, the Scottish, the Anglican Church Missionary Society, which were founded in the 1790s in Britain. American Protestants began to establish their own denominational missionary societies in the early 1800s, as did the Germans. All of them were formed as autonomous societies supported chiefly by denominational constituencies as part of evangelical revivals. In the second half of the 19th century, Protestant missionary activities became much more entangled with the colonial policy of Western powers to force, most particularly Asian countries, to open to free trade. Indeed, free trade and freedom of religion were the two main demands of the unequal treaties that Western colonial powers imposed through gunboat diplomacy. It was through the translation of these treaties into the vernacular languages that the Western category of religion emerged or entered the vocabulary of many Asian languages and cultures. Besides global missions, global migrations of European populations became another important carrier of the globalization of European Christianity throughout the 19th century. Throughout the second phase of globalization, Catholicism continued its global expansion as a world religion, carried this time by French colonialism into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and by numerous new male and female missionary religious orders, many of them originating also in France. Migrants from all over Catholic Europe, most prominently Irish migrants who accompanied the British Empire, settled throughout North America, and the immigrant settler societies of the Southern Hemisphere, South America, South Africa, and Australasia. Characteristically new of the second phase of globalization was the prominent participation of women in those processes, both as female missionaries in their own right, who play a crucial role in missionary outreach to women and children through the administration of schools and hospitals, and as members of migrant families who also play a crucial role in organizing migrant religious communities in order to transmit their religion, language, and culture to their own children. Looking at the Orthodox world during this second phase of globalization, one can observe two different and distinct dynamics. One is the expansion of the missionary activity within the Russian Empire and beyond throughout the 19th century. The other is the process of independence of Orthodox countries from the Ottoman Empire and the dynamics of reproduction of autocephalous Orthodox churches now tied to the globalization of nationalism. For Russian Orthodoxy, the second phase of globalization begins symbolically with the mission of 10 monks from the Balan Monastery to Alaska in 1792. Another milestone was the missionary work of the philologist Makarios Glukarev in the Siberian Altai Mountains from 1829 to 1843, and the publication of his important work in missiology, thoughts, and the methods to be followed for a successful dissemination of the faith among Mohammedans, Jews, and pagans in the Russian Empire. But the most important figure in the Russian missionary movement of the 19th century was Innocent Jan Beniaminov, who spent 45 years as missionary in Alaska and Siberia, beginning in 1823 as a married priest, and after the death of his wife in 1843 as missionary bishop in newly created dioceses in Alaska and Siberia. In 1868, Innocent was elected as Metropolitan of Moscow, where he established the Russian Orthodox Mission Society, modeled after Catholic and Protestant precursors. At its height, the Mission Society had over 16,000 members throughout Russia that sent and supported hundreds of missionaries in Siberia, the Pacific Coast, Alaska, Japan, China, and Korea. The Bolshevik Revolution brought an end to this Russian military tradition, although by creating exiled intellectual and theological diasporas in Paris and New York, it also contributed in its own way to the globalization of Russian Orthodox thought. Under the Rum Millet system of the Ottoman Empire, all Orthodox subjects, Greeks, Bulgarians, Albanians, Black Romanians, Serbs, Georgians, and Arabs were considered part of the same millet. Religion, rather than ethnicity or language was the primary group identity in the millet system. The ecumenical patriarch was recognized as ethnarch of all Orthodox subjects. The globalization of nationalism following the American and French revolutions undermined the millet system. Nation-building processes emerged in all Orthodox land that brought together the dynamics of political nationalism seeking independent statehood and dynamics of religious communities aiming to establish autocephalous national churches no longer under the jurisdiction of the ecumenical patriarch. Those processes were aided by the geopolitical power of the Russian Empire with the help of the Russian Orthodox Church, which increasingly viewed itself as the global protector of Orthodox Christianity against the Ottomans as well as against Western powers. As Orthodox countries became independent, they also took part in the global migrations of European peoples overseas, to North America as well as to the Southern Hemisphere, where they established separate ethno-religious diasporas as well as Orthodox religious communities as Greeks, Serbians, Ukrainians, Russians, etc. These Orthodox diaspora religious communities became now open to new and contested ecclesiastical diocesan arrangements caught between the autocephalous national church of the country of origin, the possibility of establishing new ecclesiastical arrangements in the new countries, and the aspiration to form part of a global Orthodox Ummah under a weak but independent ecumenical patriarch. The Bolshevik Revolution and the repression of Russian Orthodoxy added complexity to those dynamics, which became most contested in North America, given the complex denominational structure of American Christianity. Within the autocephalous churches of the Balkans, there is not much evidence of any missionary impulse until the emergence in the late 1950s of the International Orthodox Youth Movement, Syndesmos. This missionary awakening was led by the young theologian Anastasios Giannoulatos, who established the bilingual Greek and English missionary magazine Poreuntes Go Forth, and an inter-Orthodox mission center with the same name in Athens, with the aim of awakening the Church of Greece and the international Orthodox community to their universal evangelical responsibility. In the 1960s, Giannoulatos pioneered an Orthodox mission in East Africa until he was forced to return home by a bout of malaria. He pursued further studies and became a professor of world religions at the University of Athens in 1972, and in 1980 founded the missionary magazine of the Church of Greece, Pantata Ethne, All Nations. In the 1980s, he became acting Archbishop of East Africa, where he helped the development of the indigenous Orthodox churches in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, establishing the first Orthodox seminary in Africa. In the 1990s, Giannoulatos became Archbishop of post-communist Albania, where he helped in the reconstruction of the Orthodox Church of Albania, establishing a seminary, reestablishing the Holy Synod of Bishops, and returning the Church of Albania to official autocephalous status. One could rightly view Giannoulatos' global Orthodox missionary vision as a symbolic threshold to the third phase of globalization for Orthodoxy, in the same way as I have argued that the Second Vatican Council constitutes the symbolic point of departure for a third phase of Catholic globalization after the early modern phase of colonial Catholicism and the modern phase of different types of national Catholicism. Although the term globalization had not yet been invented, the bishops gathered at the Second Vatican Council saw and experienced the phenomenon of globalization as a sign of the times. This was possible because Vatican II was the first truly global ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, with participant bishops from all the continents and practically from every nation in the world. This was possible in turn because the Catholic Church had become a truly global church already in the two previous phases of globalization. One can understand the creative effervescence that this global gathering of bishops from all over the world generated. The last three documents of Vatican II describe the emergent phenomenon of globalization as a sign of the times. Nostra Aetate begins with the words, "In our time, when day by day mankind is being drawn closer together and the ties between different peoples are becoming stronger." Dignitatis Humanae reiterates the same idea in its concluding paragraph when it recognizes amongst the signs of the times that all nations are coming into even closer unity. Men of different cultures and religions are being brought together in closer relationship. The entire text of Gaudium et Spes can be read as a critical and prophetic discernment of both the positive dynamics and the negative consequence brought by globalization. After the Council, there took place the formation of pan-continental conferences of Catholic bishops in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Australia and the Pacific Islands, also in Europe, of course, who began to adopt broader post-national perspectives. One can also observe a shift in the dynamic center of Catholic and Protestant Christianity from the old world to the new world, and from the north to the south. The globalization of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity and reverse migrations and evangelical missions from the colonial peripheries to the old colonial centers are also key components of the new global dynamics. Looking at the contemporary globalization of Orthodoxy, one can observe the re-emergence of the second and the third Rome on the global stage. After almost 500,000 of quiet captivity under the Ottomans and under Turkey, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople has regained some stature on the global stage. His leadership as primus inter pares within the Orthodox world, most visible in his role in trying to organize the great and holy synod of the Orthodox Church in singular. His important role in global ecumenical dialogue with the papacy and with other religions, and his pastoral and prophetic voice on global issues such as the environment that resonates beyond an Orthodox audience. After decades of intra-Orthodox negotiations and preparations, the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church convened in Crete in June 2016. The synod's agenda included the mission of the Orthodox Church in today's world, the Orthodox diaspora, the proper regulation of church autonomy, i.e. autocephaly, and the relations of the Orthodox Church with the rest of the Christian world. In short, it was supposed to bring the aggiornamento of global orthodoxy, and in the words of Elizabeth Prodromou, advisor to Patriarch Bartholomew, the council was to develop, quote, a robust theology of global engagement. But the boycott of the council by the Russian Orthodox Church, along with the churches of Antioch, Bulgaria, and Georgia, and the absence of the Orthodox Church in America laid bare the serious divisions within global Orthodoxy. Most obviously, it revealed the conflict for supremacy between the second and the third Rome. After the fall of the Soviet Union, following a period of relative weakness, the Moscow Patriarchate, in alliance with the Putin regime, re-emerged with its claim of canonical territorial jurisdiction over Ruski Mir and with its claim of supremacy over the Orthodox world as primus inter pares. But the crisis in Ukraine, caused by the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, generated the conditions for the emergence of a newly reconstituted autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarch. For the Moscow Patriarchate, the loss of Ukraine means the failure of the Ruski Mir project. It also meant that they could not come to Crete to proclaim the supremacy of Russian Orthodoxy. In this respect, undermining completely their project. But besides its territorial imperial claims over Ukraine, the Moscow Patriarchate, in alliance with the geopolitical goals of the Russian regime, is now engaged in a new global project of assuming the leadership of a moralist Christian international in the global culture wars against liberalism, secularism, feminism, and gender ideology. You can all follow the work of Christina Steckel on post-secular conflicts at the University of Innsbruck on these issues. Let me finish with a few observations about Ukraine, the second largest Orthodox country in the world, the place where today the three Romes meet. A majority of the Ukrainian population, Orthodox, is now affiliated with the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. A significant minority of Ukrainian Orthodox, circa 15% of the population, is likely to remain affiliated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, that is, in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. And then there is the Ukrainian Catholic Church of Eastern Rite, comprising circa 10% of the Ukrainian population, which is in communion with the Pope in Rome. Ukraine can become either a place of conflict between the three Romes or a place of ecumenical dialogue and mutual recognition between the three sister churches. There are, moreover, significant minorities of Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim religious communities in Ukraine, all working together within the Council of Religious Communities of Ukraine. Let me end with a final observation about the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is simultaneously the most ethnic of churches, having its roots in Western Ukraine, but is also the most global of any Christian church through successive migrations of Ukrainians all over the world since the 19th century. When the Synod of Ukrainian Catholic Bishops meets regularly, either in Ukraine or in Rome, besides the 17 diocesan bishops from Ukraine, there are 2 bishops from Poland, 5 bishops from Canada, 4 bishops from the United States, 2 bishops from Brazil, 1 bishop from Argentina, 1 bishop from Australia, and 1 bishop each from London, Paris, Germany, Scandinavia, and Italy. This is a sign of the globalization of Eastern Christianity. Thank you so much for your attention.